Right, so what we're here to talk about is avoiding bad boardroom dynamics. And I've got with me today Beverly Hancock, who's our head of guide and head of appoint. So we're very well placed to answer any questions you have and give us some key insights into how to avoid bad boardroom dynamics. For those of you who haven't heard of me, met me, seen me before, I'm Tim Holmes, Senior Partner at Sirdar Group, and I've been with the organization since 2013. And for just a quick overview of what Sirdar does, so we try and make sure when we're dealing with clients that we do everything we possibly can to make a really truly effective board. So whether that's helping you and supporting you with training your directors, helping and supporting you to find and appoint directors, which we'll talk a lot about today, or if it's the ongoing guide support that you need to try and help your board become more and more effective over time. And we've got very much a focus on Africa, but we have clients and people that we've worked with on various education programs across, I think, was it 44 countries. So what drives me, and I think what drives this organization and what we want to try and talk about today as a sort of core thought, is that good directors grow companies. But it's a bit like, it's a bit ordinary, it's a bit of the not adding any special value, not really making a proper impact, sort of going through the motions, and tends to be a little bit of a tick box exercise. Was what we really want to try and create and train and develop people to be is really great directors. So we're thinking much more broadly about all of the different areas where a director can have impact. And we need to start with making sure that that team of directors that makes up the board is truly effective. So that's really what we want to try and dig in today. Digging into today is the kind of dangers, what kind of things to look out for in your board, and then also some guidelines on what we believe is a great way of changing that normal into something where your board is truly effective and your directors can really act like great directors and change lives. So impacting all stakeholders along the way. So let's start with a bit of catch up on the fundamentals. So what is the role of a director? And it's very much about three main areas. So we've got strategy, leadership, and governance. We won't talk very much about the strategy part today, and we won't really talk too much about the governance part, but I really want to emphasize on the role is about leadership. So if you are sitting in the boardroom, or if you are a director of your company, you should be demonstrating good leadership. You should be seen by the rest of the organization as being competent, skilled, and able to lead the organization forward. And the other part of governance is really about policies and procedures. So just thinking about at a board level, we don't want to dive into the actual doing in the operations. We need to be really focused on making sure that the policies and procedures are in place so that create it once, and then the rest of the organization has their plan, their standard operating procedures that they can work with to actually do the doing. As a director, we should be much more focused on the overall structure, the overall system of running a business, not diving into the detail of how we bake better bread, for example. So we want to be focused on, if we're bakers and we've got a board, we don't want the entire board to be bakers, primarily because all that happens is instead of building a better bakery or better baking business, we end up just baking better bread. So we want to get people out of operations. We want to get them to think about strategy, demonstrate leadership, and then put together policies and procedures that drive good governance through the organization. So this is what we define a high performance director as in Sirdar, and I believe it's very similar to a lot of the governance policies and principles that are out there, including King 4 and the new ISO 37000, which is well worth looking up if you haven't had a chance to yet, because it's an internationally applicable version of a governance standard rather than just being South African specific like King 4. So a high performance director is one who's obsessed with creating meaningful economic impact, and we see that as the impact via some kind of economic mechanism. So the impact down the line may be social, but at some point there's money transfer or value transfer that's helping make that difference, but through your role on the board and the role the company plays in the economy. So what is your company doing to build a better society, to build a better community around your business, and ultimately to build a better country? And furthermore, such a director is not afraid to have the tough conversations as well as do the mundane aspects that enable board success. So the key points there really being, as a director, we need to be obsessed about this stuff. This is a 24/7 engagement. This is not something that you just park and you only think about when you have the meeting. As a director, we really need to be thinking about the organizations we're on the boards of on an ongoing basis and trying to focus on what is that meaningful economic and social impact that we can make, or the organization can make. And particularly important is, if we're coming into a board as a non-exec director, how do we make sure that we're having those tough conversations and doing the mundane tasks of reading the board papers, doing the research, making sure we know and understand what this business that we're working with actually does and what the issues are. Whereas someone who's in the operations, like an executive director, it's much more intuitive because you're in it on a day-to-day basis. And then for a high-performance board, very similar, but it's about a rhythm. It's about making decisions. So what does the process look like for the board to try and get to the point where it's having proper, deep discussions and then making well thought through decisions and holding the business accountable to a higher standard than it's ever been held before is the critical piece, I think, of this statement. So that we are making sure that we are holding ourselves accountable, we're holding the executive team accountable, and we're trying to drive through the organization that we can do better. We can do this stuff more effectively. We can perform better in general throughout the organization, so that the business has the opportunity to fulfill its true potential. It's not just coasting. It's not a lifestyle business. We're creating lifestyles for everyone that's engaging with us, not just ourselves as founders and creators of the business. We want to make sure we can have the fullest impact that we can have on the societies we're working with. So improved return for shareholders, but also other stakeholders on a sustainable basis. So that's what we're about. That's why we should be in the boardroom. That's the reason why we should be engaging with the boardroom. And that's thinking about the power and the value of having an effective board. This is the kind of impact we should be having if we've got an effective board. And for any company, as soon as you register one or more directors, you effectively have a board. So let's talk about how you can use it effectively. And how do you bring other people in to make sure that it runs properly? Because your legal duty is to take this approach of care, skill, and diligence. So the Companies Act specifically measures the decisions you make on this framework. So did you take care in your approach to decision making? Did you take the opportunities and make time to build your skills and knowledge and understanding, not only of business, but also of directorship and what is the law telling you? So do you understand the basic concepts that are in the Companies Act? Do you understand the basic concepts that are in King 4? Because they apply to all businesses, particularly in South Africa. And now this ISO 37000 standard applies to any business anywhere. So it's thinking about, have we actually educated ourselves about the things that we should and are expected to understand as a director? And then are we diligent? Are we preparing? So that's that mundane part. Are we preparing for the meetings? Are we thinking things through and paying attention to detail? Do we have an understanding of the financials, or are we just relying on individuals within the team to give us those numbers without interrogating them properly? Oh, I don't understand about financials. It's so-and-so's problem. As soon as you are in the place of being a director, it's your problem too. You need to understand it. You need to at least be able to understand a balance sheet and an income statement. And the other part is the fiduciary duties. And this is where often the bad performance kicks in. We're not in the room, in a boardroom, acting in good faith. In other words, acting with the business's best interest at heart. We're tending to let other emotions, other alliances get in the way. So we're either thinking with our shareholder hat on, or we're thinking with our employee hat on, or we're putting ourselves forward and trying to get some kind of personal gain out of this relationship instead of thinking about how do we put the business forward. And all of us can think of examples that have been in the press recently where this personal gain part is causing massive problems. It's happening in state-owned enterprises, it's happening in listed companies, it's happening in the consulting companies that have been working from outside South Africa with companies in South Africa. It's all about the wrong priorities. They're not acting in good faith with the organizations they're dealing with. So we want to make sure that we're weeding that out of our organizations and we're aware of it when it comes up, because otherwise we just get these massive failures. So this good governance is so important, because company failures really happen because of this lack of skill, this lack of an effective board. So there's clear skills limitations and the absence of experience in core business areas and the inability of non-exec directors to hold the senior executives to account. So if we haven't got strong enough non-exec directors, or we just don't have non-exec directors at all, then how on earth do we hold the executive directors accountable? How do we make sure that we're following those guidelines? We're putting the business first, because we're, as executives, far too much in the weeds. We're far too much concerned about the day-to-day operations and not thinking strategically enough. Or we've brought in a friend as a non-exec director, and it's all a bit pally and chummy, and we're not holding each other accountable to the extent that we should do. So that's really the power of independent non-exec directors, is they've got a lot less emotional connection with the other individuals in the room, can be much more objective when looking at the way we're making decisions, and hopefully pick up things that we just can't see because we're just too close to the problem. And this is how it shows up. So Enron, Parmalat, a lot of accounting fraud stuff going on there. Were the directors clued up enough? Did they have enough understanding and skill in financials? Were they just not seeing it? Was it being hidden from them? Were they asking enough questions? Did they just not care because the business was doing well at a particular point in time, but they didn't dig into why? All of those kind of things come into play. And as directors, we need to really dig into what's going on behind the scenes. We can't just take the numbers at face value. We need to look out for the trends. We need to do reasonability tests. We need to be getting experience from other businesses that are a similar size or similar space to try and see, does this make sense? So that we can pick these kind of things up as much as possible. Still, it is possible to cover this stuff up to the extent where directors can't see it clearly, but we should at least be making the effort. And that lack of independence, so all three of these companies suffer from that. And again, it becomes everybody makes a decision because they just go along with the flow. So there's a dominant voice, and we're all friends. We've known each other for years, or we're family members. The nepotism part came in Parmalat's story. We're all members of the same family. We've got our wives or husbands on the board, all of that kind of thing. There is very little or no independence in that room that's standing up and going, whoa, hold on, we're not going in the right direction here. This is not in the best interest of the business. And then overall lack of accountability, when we're just not holding people account to the way we should. So if we can get that kind of stuff right, and that's in our minds what bad performance in a board looks like, if we can get that kind of stuff right, then we can really make an impact. We can really make much more resilient companies and actually more profitable companies. So boards with at least one independent, so this is from our director survey from last year, boards with at least one independent director are evaluated as significantly more effective than boards without any. And we've seen this because you're just bringing a different perspective to that room. You're asking different questions, difficult questions often, that someone who's too close to the business is just not going to think of. So we can see from the outside in things that it's very difficult to see when you're in the day-to-day, when you're in the weeds. And the other part is that an increase in EBITDA is enjoyed by boards that have female representation around the boardroom table and have greater ethnic diversity and conduct board evaluations annually. So Beverly will talk a little bit more about this. Very critical things which are far too often not done in terms of valuations, or not thought about or not implemented in terms of having a much more diversity at board level. We want people who think differently, have got different experience, that are thinking about from the perspective of more of our clients. If we have people on the board who are all very similar, then we tend to think in a particular way, and we miss the tsunamis coming because we just can't see them. So let's jump into it, Beverly.
Well,
this is
hello.
your space. Welcome to the call. And if you've got any Q&A questions as they come up, certainly anything on the foundational stuff you're not sure about, I didn't explain particularly clearly, then put it in the Q&A and we'll go through it at the end. So Bev, this is your world. This is where you live, appointing directors and now moving into the space of running the board part as well in our team. What are these dangerous assumptions that people generally make when they're thinking about who they should put on their board?
Thank you, Tim. And absolutely, I think, one of the pleasures I have is working with boards, and working with boards when they look at how effective they are and how they need to be effective, and also who they're appointing. And there's a lot of assumptions that are made. Often, one would hear, well, we know who we want. And the question you have to ask yourself, whether you are looking to build a board, or if you have a pretty mature board, it's still saying, do you really know who you need? Have you done that deep dive into understanding the balance of the board? And we're going to dive into that a little bit later. But not just understanding or thinking that, I need someone who has legal understanding, who understands my industry and can add value in that way. But really diving a lot deeper, and we're going to go into that. And the same applies to, and I think, Tim, you've been touching on this, is we need someone like us. Well, that's great. But by having a whole someone like us's, how does that affect the decision-making in that board? How does that affect the conversation that you have? And is the conversation robust? And the outcomes from that conversation, the real outcomes and the right decisions for that business moving forward and that board moving forward. Because it does take diversity of thought, and we're going to look at that, to actually be able to address what needs to be addressed in the boardroom and at board level in order to move forward. And so often we see, and this is still, very much in the play, is relying on referrals. So, often you'll have a list of potentials, and that's because, Joe Blogg said to me that, Dirk was fantastic on my board. He's absolutely brilliant. He brings this and he'll be great for you. But there's a reality in that. Your board is made up differently. Your business is made up differently. Because someone is a fit on one board, it doesn't mean they're going to add the value on another board. Doesn't mean that person isn't fantastic. It does mean that they are not right for your board. And it's about building the board that is going to be the most effective board for you. Another thing that...
Sorry, just going to say, part of that, Bev, is that stage of growth. So if someone's really good at taking a business from sort of getting to the end of the startup phase into a properly mature business, that's their forte, then, and they've been working really well with the business in that space that needed that energy, but then they come into a business that's very mature, it's been around for 20 years, it's got completely different challenges, they're not going to be able to add value at anything like the same extent, and vice versa. So if someone needs that energy to change things up and bring in new ideas to move the business to the next level and build the foundations and structure to take it to the next level, they're not going to need somebody who's been on a listed board, for example, that hasn't experienced that and hasn't followed that journey in the past.
Absolutely.
So absolutely critical to get the right person in the room.
Absolutely, I agree with you. And that's about understanding, even in a mature board, there's going to be growth and change because your target market has changed. What do you need? Well, the skills and experience that you need to come on at that time for the next 2 to 3 years, for example. And that is why board tenure is also important, and another discussion we could dive into as well. But one of the other assumptions that we have, it's also about having people on a board for sort of 10, 12 years and no change, because everything else is around has changed. The also about how do you approach your appointing and your assessment of what is the ideal non-executive director at the time. Because often what we do is we use a referral system, or we use an executive search company or a recruitment company, whereby what we're doing is we're saying, this is who we think is right for us. This is what we've done in the past, and please go and find that person. And what happens is you get a number of candidates, you appoint someone, and a year down the line, you're going, but this isn't what we're looking for. There are multiple reasons why the board is not delivering as it should be. And we needed to dive deeper. And this is where doing a board diagnostic, for example, will really bring a lot to the table in terms of who is the ideal person. Where are you at now? We look at all the governance areas, and it'll support that journey. So it's almost taking a step back. Instead of saying, who, we know who we want, it's to really go back and have a look at where the board is, where the business is, and then make informative decisions around that. The other thing as well is where we look at appointing industry experts and specialists, very much sometimes around we know who we want. At Sadar, we say the best non-executive directors for your board may not come from your industry. And the reason being is the industry experts are sitting around the table already. So sometimes, for example, it might be in an FMCG environment where, yes, an understanding of manufacturing is advantageous. But really, there are so many other areas that are going to bring the value to the board. For example, business growth. Your strategy is to grow and be a multinational. That's not sitting around the table potentially.
Yep,
it might
absolutely.
be that someone brings a marketing exposure to a different market, an understanding of that. So these are the areas that sometimes we don't consider when we think we know who we want.
Yeah, very much so. Thank you.
Yeah.
We were just going through the list of things that we came up with. So diversity was one of them. And then, whoops, I've got this order's gone all over the place. Sorry about that. Profile, and then skills and experience, and digging a little bit about that high EQ, because it is absolutely critical if you want to avoid the bad board experiences. We need people who can see the emotions in the room, speak adult to adult, instead of that getting into that parent-child kind of conversation, which can often happen when emotions start to flare and starts to get a little bit more difficult to have a logical conversation. And then right at the end, we can go through the what next. But yeah, I love that talking about having the same people around the room, and this cartoon was just a classic. So we need to innovate and stop following the herd. We need to make sure we've got different perspectives, different opinions in the room. And this is probably more like how a lot of South African boards and boards across the world find themselves, that they end up adding people that look and sound and think like themselves. And this, we've noticed, is across cultures and across religious groups and across countries. They end up with people sitting around the table who are all very similar. Maybe went to similar schools, have a similar religion, come from a similar race group, whatever it might be, so that they're highly likely to think in the same way and not necessarily going to see opportunities or threats coming as quickly as if there's a little bit more diversity around the room. So do you want to maybe just go into the diversity aspects that we were talking about earlier, Bev?
Yeah, thanks very much, Tim. And here we can talk about, known and recognized areas of diversity, gender, ethnicity, and so forth. But really, we like to take it to the next level. I call it diversity of thought. Our learned colleague, Roger Hitchcock, calls it cognitive diversity. But really what it is to look at, in the boardroom, we need to bring certainly a diversity of thought, because that is where you have the creativity, the strategy drive, the discussions, and the outcomes that will add value. And, so often we find that one of the issues that we're talking about and we wanted to address today is that whole sort of frustration you feel in your boardroom. And it might be in your existing board where you're feeling people aren't adding value. And it might be that they added value 2 years ago, but they're not adding value now. And that's about looking at where do we bring in the diversity of thought that's going to take you from now for the next period. And so there's things we need to look at. Location. It might be that when you're looking to grow, you need someone who's situated in West Africa because that's an area that you want to grow in and understands what it's like on the ground, has built business in West Africa and can guide you in that space and guide the organization in that space. It could be someone who sits in South Africa, in KZN, because that's an area you want to grow in. Or that because of the board dynamics and how it's set up in terms of business, you need someone who sits in, for example, Europe and is going to support a board that sits in Africa. So location is one thing to consider. Experience is another. And by experience, we're talking about business. We're talking about life experience. We're talking about board experience. We're talking about an industry experience. So it's about what is the experience that the individual has that is going to add value in the conversations. So that's important to look at. And it might be that someone comes from a different upbringing, a different space, and can relate far better than you or your existing board members to where the market needs to be and where you need to be driving that business, whether it's stakeholder engagement, marketing, and so forth. Another area, and this is so often not touched on, and Tim, I think you and I both are very aware that this is really an area so neglected and yet so incredibly important, is what is the natural energy of your board? And by that we mean, how does your board make decisions? The individual profiles of your board members that make up your board profile. And that is whether someone, and we'll touch on a bit later, is whether someone's got really high activating energy, or someone is very detail orientated and is going to be the person that asks the 40 questions, or the person who has the capability to hear all and make sure things are driven through. Or your person who's a natural people person, strong leader, and really focuses on that space. Because that is how, when you have a well-balanced board, you have an effective board. Because we've all sat in rooms where there might be 6 people in a room, and there is so much discussion around ideas and how brilliant everything is and what we could be doing and what we should be doing, Tim, that, because we have this really in our business all the time, is how to pull back and who's the person in the room or persons in the room saying who is doing it, where is the funding, and what are we doing? And the reverse is true. 6 people in a room, all too focused on the detail and the risk to allow for the creative thinking and drive and strategy to move forward. So that is what we talk about when we talk about a balanced board, and in our space we use contribution compass, which we'll speak to. The other thing is skills, and this is your core skills and your general skills. So yes, there will be a need around, for example, a marketing, someone who understands marketing, someone who understands the legalities of a certain country, for example, finance certainly in many spaces, and then your general skills, such as, and not so general, but also pretty specific, is someone who knows how to build business, someone who's been there and done that, someone who is restructured, someone potentially in M&A. It all depends on where do you want to take your business to. And this is something you constantly need to be thinking about as well, and we'll look at that. Then absolutely, very, very important. And I think, Tim, you related to this earlier in terms of the feedback we have and the survey report we have around gender. Female representation on a board, higher beta. That's been shown in the last 12 months, since 12 months previously. So women are not afraid to ask the hard questions. point of fact. And so it's really important to get different voices, different perceptions, because perception is often reality, into that boardroom. The same with ethnicity. It's exactly the same process in terms of adding the real value into that boardroom and being able to make detailed decisions through having an informed discussion. And the same with age. And often we relate the age factor to the technology space. In this new world that we live in. We all jumped very quickly into having to be online in the last 2-3 years. And of course, businesses are just flowing through now, much in the digital world. So do we have people that understand our market, if our market is of an age? Do we understand people who know what technology will support us? And they don't have to come from the same industry. It's all about bringing new ideas into that place. So those are some of the areas where we talk about diversity, Tim.
Yeah, and I think it also needs to be matched to your client base. So if you're trying to appeal to a younger market and your boards of old grey-haired people like me who got struggle to understand the latest trends in technology and fashion and whatever else it might be, then you're going to miss some really important opportunities. So it's take that leap, find someone who's really keen to learn, is in that space and can add value, and bring them onto the board, even if it's just to present a board paper. Get them exposed to the board process, give them an opportunity to help and support you to think differently and come up with different ideas in that room. And ideally get them, if you can find someone who's really got that sense of responsibility and can think strategically, then bring someone who's younger than you might normally have risked bringing onto the board, bring them onto the board. I mean, our founder, Carl Bates, who's now gone off to start a career in politics in New Zealand, had his first board position at 18. So why don't we do that more often? Why don't we bring people in, build them up? It's part of a succession planning process, but it also just brings fresh and new and different ideas that we're normally exposed to. So yeah, take that risk. I think age is definitely probably the last bastion on that list, which really hasn't been addressed at all in a lot of cases. Mm. Yeah, so this was just sort of thinking about recruitment in general and how critical it is. And I think it's often within the operations, we've got some sense of how important understanding what someone's personality profile is like. But somehow we don't do it in the same space or same way when we're looking at the board. So yes, it's different things that we're looking for, but it's the same concept, because I can't change your profile. So like using that contribution compass identifier, filling in all the details of what we think the role is that we need for the board, and then it's saying, okay, well, you need a champion profile or a conductor profile. I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. Is really critical, because then you can look at who's already in the boardroom and then work out, okay, well, yes, there is a gap there, or no, I think we've got the spec wrong. And we're actually seeking out the wrong person, because all we're doing is repeating what we've already got in the room. And if I don't get that right at the point of bringing someone in or before someone comes in, I can't change it. That's the way they think. That's the way they're going to act. And if it's not what we're looking for, we're going to have a problem, and we end up rotating them out much quicker than we possibly should have done. So start with profile, because you can't change it. Then the values and attitude fit is about the values of the organization. So for a director particularly, you don't want diversity of a value set. You want to make sure everybody at least buys into the culture and the values of the organization, because we're in a leadership role. We need to demonstrate those values so they get inculcated into the rest of the organization. So yes, very much diversity of profile, very similar value set and way of approaching problems, etc., is useful in the boardroom. And then a cross-section of skills according to stage of growth, type of industry, all the rest of it, to make sure we've got as many of the bases covered. So what this contribution compass profiling tool looks like, and I love it because it's so simple to present an idea and present a concept, but there's the complexity as soon as you start digging into the levels. So as Bev mentioned earlier, we've got the concept of activating and sustaining energy. Activating is very much about enjoying change, finding out new things, chasing after the new shiny technology, that kind of thing. I'm very much a catalyst profile, and I love new technologies and new stuff. I get bored quite quickly. Whereas sustaining energy is much more about doing the process and doing it well and doing it consistently, a very strong energy in operations. Now they are completely different and they're pulling in totally opposite directions. But if we don't have exposure to both those energies in the boardroom, we end up making lots of decisions, coming up with lots of ideas and never implementing them. And then the left and right, the refining and inspiring, is about people energy versus more of the extrovert energy and more of the introverted energy, which is about data and controlling chaos. And again, if we want to make sure that we're servicing our clients, we're keeping our employees engaged and the level of giving them the level of importance that they need, we need at least a quarter of our energy to be in the inspiring space. But we also, on the other side, in the refining space, need to be managing our financials, managing our data. Where's our sales data? Where's our expenses and cost data? Are we actually able to manage and monitor what's going on in the business effectively? And as someone who's got strong refining energy will naturally ask those kinds of questions. So at a board level, we need this team to be covering as many bases as possible. But in your operational teams, they'll tend to have a specific focus. So it's critical that we understand who's sitting around the table, because what happens is we end up going in a particular direction, and this is the CERDAR governance compass. So you can see if you've got lots of activating energy, you're great at coming up with a strategy, and this is where we're going, yeah, rah, 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 but we don't see the risks, and we ignore the compliance, we don't think about how we're going to generate returns for shareholders, we don't think about how we're going to engage with stakeholders. So we start to miss really important things in the overall picture that we need to be thinking about when we're on the board. So when you're going through your process, Bev, how in your experience, how important has that profile been? Have there been times where you sort of know, no, we definitely, they're the right person for the board, it's okay, the profile doesn't matter, and then down the line you think, oh, we should have listened to our own story and our own teachings and actually been harder on making sure that we had the right profile in the room?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and I think this is where we've seen the success, not only in our own business, because we use it at board, at management and functional. And I've seen other businesses where it's been such an effective tool in understanding how a balanced team delivers and is more effective. It's been taken from board through functional teams. And there's certainly examples, because you can have amazing people in the room with amazing profiles and amazing CVs. But when they are not being able to support the effective process around what needs to be done, then there are going to be, you know, things fall through the gap where, oh, we don't need to look at risk because, you know, it should be looked at annually, but that isn't what excites us. You know, stakeholder engagement, vital. We haven't looked at why we haven't, you know, looked at our new market. So yeah, let's take that next step forward and dive into that next slide.
Yeah, so this was really talking about skills and what types of skills people need as directors, because it's actually a much longer list than most of us really understand. Is that the last one? No, that was the last one. Sorry. So the legal responsibilities we've covered a little bit of. So it's your fiduciary duties, your care, skill and diligence is what the Companies Act is telling us you need to do. And then there's the codes and standards. So they're not prescriptive, but it's very much a comply or explain kind of concept, certainly with King 4, and now that's been taken into ISO 37000. So a lot of the same people that were involved in King 4 have also helped develop this new ISO 37000 standard. And it's interesting, it's the first one that's not legislative. It's a principles-based standard. So ISO have also realized that there are certain areas where you can give guidance, but you can't set rules because things change too much and it's too easy to get around the rules and tick the boxes without really implementing what was the original core understanding or idea behind that rule in the first place. And then that methodology and process, I think you were going to talk about this a little bit later, and we've talked about policies and procedures. So if you don't understand how to put together policies and procedures, if you don't think they're important, you're going to struggle as a director, because that's a key part of your role to make sure that those are set up and reviewed frequently, and they're clear and easy to implement. And we had a classic example in the board meeting recently where we'd done a dividend policy 6 months ago, and we're now in a situation where we had more cash than we expected. And it wasn't clearly defined on how we worked out how much we kept in working capital and how much we put into the rainy day fund. So we had to clarify one of the paragraphs, and then immediately after making that decision and saying, right, yes, we're signing off the updated dividend policy, we were going through the financials and realized we were in exactly that situation. So we just went back, read the policy. Okay, what did we say we were going to do? We're going to do this, we're going to do that, blah, blah, blah. Done. Easy. Because it was clear, it covered all of the bases, it gave you very specific parameters you need to work with, and you can come up with an exact number, give it to the finance manager, and they make it happen. So all of those policies and procedures are absolutely critical, because they make decision making much easier, and they also help the organization run and people take responsibility for what they're doing without having to keep referring back to the CEO or referring back to the board with those really repetitive and unnecessary questions. And yeah, we've talked about demonstrating leadership, and that difference between being a director and management. Directorship is very different. Management doesn't necessarily have to think an awful lot in the day-to-day about strategy, but a director should be thinking about strategy all the time and shouldn't be lost in the detail of how you make this particular widget. It's thinking about what are we going to do next, thinking about how we're going to make that process more efficient, thinking about, do we need to move to a different region, area, build a factory in a different country? That's what we need to be thinking about as directors. And that's not necessarily something that management, certainly at lower levels of management, ever even have the opportunity to think about or contribute to. So experience we had on the list, non-exec director. So just thinking about what kinds of experience is really useful. So obviously the first one, if you want to be in a director, then having some kind of non-exec director experience is immensely valuable, because you've, in that space, had to focus on the director role rather than thinking about being a director in the business that you started or the business that you're operationally involved in. It separates out the hats really effectively, because that's the only one you're wearing. So if you can get a non-exec director role anywhere, somewhere, it definitely adds value to the organization you're working in on a day-to-day basis, and hopefully you increase your understanding of how this whole thing works. Even just getting on a committee can make a difference. To get to understand how this group of people work together or not. So if nothing else, you can learn how not to do it by serving on a few committees. So then you can start to dig in to think about, well, how do we do this better? What is best practice? What is the downside of the way that these people argue all the time and never make a decision, which is quite common in committees. But get that experience. Governing bodies also, if you've got a flat or a house or somewhere that's in a complex or has got some kind of governing body linked to it, go and get onto that governing body. You may never want to get on a governing body ever again in your life, because they can be absolutely terrible, but it's a great way of learning and understanding how critical all of this stuff is, because there's so much of this bad performing committees, boards, bodies out there. We really need to know how to do them better and how to stand up and be the voice that says, now hold on guys, there's a better way. If we do this, that and the other, then we'll get where we need to get to. Executive director helps to be on a board of some description, really helps to have a good broad understanding of business rather than very siloed, just knowing about sales or just knowing about finance or just knowing about HR or operations or whatever it might be. Have a broad understanding of business. And as far as possible, know a little bit more about more than one industry. But if you do have an understanding of an industry, take that knowledge of that particular industry into another industry where it can help. So there may be things that have been done in one industry and done really well in one industry, but that knowledge is an opportunity somewhere where they haven't thought about things that way. It could be a IT industry, you're now going into something that was very mechanized, and how does that improve? So think about how your industry and knowledge of your industry benefits somewhere else. And if you can, certainly if you can get some kind of chairmanship role, it really helps to understand how this meeting thing should run, how you can bring the room to order, how do you act as a leader in that space, but not dominate the conversation with your particular ideas. high IQ, I won't go into this in an awful lot of detail, but it's really important to have people in the room who can read the room, who can check the emotions, keep their own emotions in check. They go back and think about, well, cool, how can I do that better next time? Going through that self-reflection exercise. Don't get caught up in the emotion in the room. Boards are one place where we need to be able to control our emotions, think logically, and talk to each other as adults, and not get lost in the defensive mechanisms and the emotional outbursts which typically happen. And it's just a definition from Business Day. So what are we going to do now? So if you've got bad boardroom dynamics, now what? So Bev, do you want to dig into this? I mean, the critical one that we came up with was toxic leaders can kill companies. And there's been quite a few examples. I tried to think of one, but there was one website that had 25, and I just didn't have time to go through them all and pick one or two specifically. But it's amazing how often that toxic leader, the narcissist, often just takes control over that boardroom, and their way is the right way, and no one else really has a voice. So how do we get rid of those people? How do we move them on, move them out, move them into another space? Bev, you got an example you can share with everybody?
Absolutely, and it is about often the most important way to start is by understanding, because often what we know, when it's written down in black and white, it becomes a lot more of a statement. And by doing a diagnostic, for example, on the board, is going to be able to look at then where do we sit, who do we need to move in and out. And I think maybe if we can go through, the rest in terms of cleaning house, and we can dive into the methodology about looking at it, we can move on with that, because it is about understanding who you have in the room, who needs to stay in the room, and who does need to go. And by doing board evaluations, by doing board diagnostics, it's going to support the change that needs to happen often. And sometimes we are certainly frustrated, and we'll dive into that now, around someone in the room with you. And it's often because we haven't taken the time to really look at who we need in that room. So you might say, I need a chartered accountant, but that chartered accountant isn't that deep dive person that you need. It's the person that's the ideas person, that thinking person. And so your assumption is not correct when you think I need a chartered accountant, because you haven't looked at all the detail that makes up that whole profile. So, it's definitely about taking that step back and doing a diagnostic of the board.
Yeah, and if you don't know who to bring into the room, then, as you said, do an annual board evaluation. Will give some insight as to how effectively the board is working. It's critical to use some kind of outside party to do that evaluation, because otherwise you're too close to the problem and you're not necessarily seeing it, and they can come in and give you an objective opinion. It's one way of uncovering where the problems might be. Otherwise, you can do a much more in-depth diagnostic of the whole governance setup of the organization, which brings in, what's the maturity in terms of strategy and culture and leadership, etc. It's a much bigger picture of what's going on, and part of it obviously is the performance of the board, but that's not so much the focus. It's more what is the right fit, and then let's look at the board and work out, based on what we've uncovered from the organizational setup, what does the board need to have in it in terms of skills and experience to take the organization forward. So that was one of those, another part of the survey was saying that a total of 77% of businesses reported that their board's impact on the business could be more effective, but they'd never conducted a formal board evaluation, or not done so in less than once a year. And of 58% of businesses who experienced a decreased EBITDA reported that they'd never conducted board evaluation. So why not? You're reporting that your business is slowly going downhill and EBITDA is under pressure, but you've never even done an evaluation of your board's performance. We do that all the time in our operational space, but for some reason we think we're different because we're directors. We think we're above it, or we don't need it, or there's some kind of ego that kicks in as soon as we've got director in front of our name. So what's the kind of process that you follow, Bev, on methodology to try and make sure we've got the right people in the room?
Thanks, Tim. I think one of the most important, the place to start is the why. And as a Simon Sinek fan, it feeds right into that, the why. But the why in this place sits on two levels. The first is, understanding why does that non-executive director want to sit in your boardroom? Why does that non-executive director, for example, want to be a non-executive director? The basics. Do they want to give back? Do they want to share their knowledge, experience, understanding? Or do they want to sit on a board and make money? And it's as basic as that, because a lot of frustration comes through ineffective boards where there's not a contribution by the non-executive directors around the table. And it's because they're not committed in that space. You know, they're not reading the board papers and they're not adding to the discussion. Sometimes it's just that those directors are highly effective directors, but in terms of the business journey, they need you need a different personality and different skill set and different experience sitting in that space.
Yeah, it's that diligence piece. It's really important. So they're there for the paycheck, but then when you get that in the employee space, the board's no different. It's probably easier to get away with it on a board than it is as an employee, but it's no different.
Absolutely. And the why then reverts to yourself, whether CEO, board member, founder, entrepreneur, is always start with the end in mind. Where do you want to be at the end? You know, do you want to sell the business? Do you want to stay on as a shareholder and really not get involved operationally? Or do you want to do what you love and leave the decision making to someone else? So it's understanding that. And I think that plays a vital part to being able to make decisions as to how you want to move forward. And the other thing as well is that not only being, am I ready for a board? Often the fear is that there's going to be someone else in the room that's going to take the decision away from me. And a very quick example, because I'm aware of the time, is this is public knowledge. So I feel I can share it. But Power Fashion, a highly successful family-owned firm. They're operating for 60 years. They had 50 stores and doing very well for themselves. Founder-led, founder-run, very hands-on. And then they went down the board route in 2016. And they built in 5 years from 50 stores to 170 stores. And that is by having other voices around the table. Voices who brought experience, skills, abilities from outside their sphere. And the experts were sitting around the table in terms of the business itself and the industry, but bringing in how to grow business, bringing in strategy, bringing in all these other areas. And not only did they grow their business in 5 years to triple, but they then sold their business to Mr. Price for, I think it was around 1.6 billion. So it doesn't have to just be in the listed space we're talking. You know, we're talking about family owned, we're talking about privately owned organizations. And that's often why we need to look at the why. Where do we want to be? And we've spoken about profiles, that balanced board, that balanced space, you know, understand who you need around the table on multiple levels. That speaks to experience as well and to the skills that are needed. Tim spoke to this earlier, ability. You may not need a chairperson now as an independent chairperson, but can the person you take on serve that role in 2 years' time? Are you going to need someone in your audit and risk committee? What is the ability and the experience of that individual? Without doubt, one of the areas that does need to be aligned is values, because often frustrations will sit in there because you think someone's fantastic and you were told they're brilliant, but their values differ to yours. So very important to address. One of the other areas is the capacity to serve, time commitments. You know, if you're having someone who sits on 10 boards, what is the reality of them reading your board papers on a monthly basis, looking out, because as a director, you know, you're never not on duty, even if you have a quarterly board meeting or bi-monthly. So what is the real capacity to serve that business? And then, of course, background checks. You know, we do that for employees. We do that for people that we value and we want to bring into our organization because the organization must grow. But it's also important to get references on those around you and understand qualifications, the criminal checks, all of those director checks. And it becomes more important as we go along. You know, we've seen that in industry today. We hear that in the news of the challenges around this space.
Right,
So those
thanks,
are
Beth.
a few of the things.
So understanding. So one of the things is key. Everybody must understand the role of the director. So it's the shareholders needs to start from shareholders, but also everyone in the board as well needs to understand what the role of the director is. Because if you get everyone on board and understanding why they're there, it's much easier to have the conversation to say, look, actually, right now, you're not the right fit. And we need to move you in and move you off and bring someone else in. And one of the sort of things that is not well understood is it's actually easier to remove a director than it is to remove an executive, because it's a shareholder decision. And you don't have to give any specific reason, actually. You just have to have an opportunity to tell the individual why they, and it's not the right time for them to, they're not needed right now, and they need to move on, and then give them a chance to ask questions and have a hearing, as it were. But it's not like a criminal case or a written warning. They're just stating the case, and then off you go. Appoint the right director. Bez gives them quite a lot of detail on how you appoint the right director, and if anybody needs any help with that, then that's something we do, and happy to put you on to Bev to have that conversation. Choose the profile that fits the gap in the team, so understand what is the profile of all the individuals around the room, and then where is that gap, and use something like the contribution identifier to work out if you've defined the role in such a way and you're advertising the role in such a way that you will fill that gap and find the right profile. Clear match of values, so part of your interview process, well, starting and making sure you understand what your actual values and culture of the organization are before you try to bring anyone else in. But then when you do, make sure there's a match. I was talking to someone earlier this week where they'd merged two companies, and why the merger failed within 5 months was because they hadn't dug into what the value systems were of the two organizations in anything like enough detail. And as soon as they started working together, they realized there was a massive conflict, and then the whole thing blew up. So it's critical. If we haven't got it right at director level, never mind organizational level, and how on earth do we expect to be successful? So right skills and experience, do regular board evaluations, and if you haven't done before, do a detailed diagnostic.
And Desiree has a good question here, actually. How do we deal with the domineering founder director who's also a chairperson? An independent chairperson, Desiree?
Yeah, you leave the board if you can, because it's a really tough job. But it might be an education process. It could be a consult process, but it's really tough if that individual is dominating the conversation, not letting anyone else in. We've had this situation with a large company that was growing like crazy. The staff were pushing from underneath to say, look, we can do better than this. We need to have different directors on the board, or we need to have a different board process, but the founder just wasn't interested. So it is massively difficult, and it might take approaching the problem from multiple areas. Maybe you need to get in with their wife or significant other and try and convince them to have a word, to speak to someone about it at least, and then bring in someone who's independent to say, look, this is the way things work most effectively. Can you see that there's any things you could do in this direction? Yeah, it's really tough. So if there aren't other shareholders to put pressure on them, there aren't other directors who can pull them aside and say, look, we need to do things differently. It's just good business sense to do it. Then you're gonna struggle. You really are. And that's often where boards become completely ineffective because of that one individual. And actually, as a director, you're putting yourself at a lot of risk by being in that situation, because the decisions they make tend to be their decisions. And if you don't buy into that decision, or you think there's a risk involved in that decision, you will be brought into that. If anything goes wrong, you will be included in that court case, and you will be included in the potential risk of failure. So yes, it's now with the New Companies Act, you'd be really, really careful about who's making the decisions, how they're making the decisions, and are you going to be complicit if something goes wrong, just by the fact that you are a director, but had no power to influence that decision in the first place. How much of getting the right board composition is art and how much is science? So we've talked a lot about the science stuff. So profile is very much science. It's relatively straightforward. We need a spread of different energies because There's one energy that the activating asks the what question. They'll come up with the basic idea of the what are we going to do. The inspiring energy will think about the who. So who's going to take that idea forward? Do we have the right people in the right place, in the right countries, etc., who can take that idea forward? Then you're going to bring in sustaining energy that's going to talk about the when and the where. So what's the timing of this thing? What's the place of this thing? Have we got an understanding of which country, which city, what the timing is? Are we too late? Are we too early? Or is it something we need to do now? And then the refining energy is very much about the how. So if you've got a spread of those energies in the room, that's science. You're going to get a better result because you're going to answer all those questions. You're going to get a flow around the room. You're going to be able to make decisions more quickly, and they're going to be filling in more of the gaps. And as an organization, you're going to get much more flow going as well, because you're handing things over with enough information for the next party to pick it up and run with it. The art bit is, I suppose, the understanding the nuances of what stage of growth the business is at, and what makes sense in terms of the right director to fill that gap. If you've got a dominant shareholder or a dominant party in the boardroom, you need to obviously make sure you've got really good negotiators, really good facilitators, really good, very high EQ people coming in who can have that conversation without getting shot down. So they can come at that problem from different ways, make suggestions, drip feed the different ideas to slowly move that board or those individuals in the right direction. It's a different kind of energy from someone who, if they're coming into a board, that board's very static and stable and is not moving and not changing and not coming up with new ideas. There's a different energy to come in and shake things up and make sure that the organization moves forward with new energy. So that's the sort of art part. Profile gives you some of the answer, but the art piece is lots of experience, lots of failures and successes that we bring together and try and help and make that easier. So I suppose it's the similar kind of thing in building a business. It's a similar kind of thing in recruiting operationally too. There is definitely a balance of art and the science in this space as well. Are the issues of diversity of boards global in its impact, or are they any local contextual differences? So we've got legislation that means we need to have more diversity, but in context, there are all over the world far too many boards or leadership teams, as I said before. So in the Jewish communities, their boards are all Jewish men, for example. There's very little diversity in bringing women in the boards. They don't have other cultures on the boards. They don't have maybe representation of some of their clients on the boards. The same in countries where they've got a big Catholic population. Tend to have the same religious ideals, which they're applying to the business, and they'll tend to, again, not necessarily have a diversity of ethnicity or gender, etc., on those boards. I'm not trying to pick on Catholics or Jewish as a religion specifically, but that's across tribes, across languages, across genders, across everything. There's just too much of the same in the room. And that was been interesting doing the research. Everybody knows about the fact that lots of boards are dominated by white Caucasian males. That's a statistic, but it's also statistically important to understand that wherever the board is, whichever country it's in, everyone around the board table tends to look and sound the same, because we naturally bring people into the team that are like us. And whoever starts that process is going to bring in lots more people like them. So I don't know if that answers your question, Kenneth.
We have one more, and we appreciate that we have overstepped the mark. We've got one with Sela and Desiree. Thank you. We see that. We'll come back to you on that, and if Keller as well. But Sela, is it appropriate to apply for a board membership? Wouldn't that compromise independence? I think there's that variable between an independent non-executive director and a non-executive director. An independent non-executive director has no ties at any level to the board or to individuals within the board. So I'm not quite sure of your question there, Matsela. We can certainly engage, and we'll come back to you around that. You can sit on the board as a non-executive director with involvement in some level, or you consider the independent or a non-executive.
Yeah, so independence means you haven't been an employee for at least 3 years. You haven't got a close relationship from a family perspective or friendship perspective with anyone else that's on the board. Preferably, you're not a service provider of some description, so you're not a consultant or service provider like an auditor or a lawyer to that organization. It's those kind of things. So you are truly independent. You're coming in you've been employed to be a director, but you don't have any prior arrangement with anything else to do with the organization, because then you can come in with a clean perspective, and you're not emotionally connected to the outcome. Because you're not trying to manage relationships with other parties when you're making decisions. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for your questions. I hope that's at least sparked some thoughts. And we look forward to engaging with you. There's my own email address, there's Beverly's email address. And as we said, if you've put something in the chat box, then we'll certainly get back to you and give you more information. And it's worth going to the cerdargroup.com website and looking under the resources. There's a whole host of ebooks. There's the latest and historical surveys, etc., etc. So thank you very much. And we'll be sharing the video of this session with a follow-up email within the next day or two. So thank you very much. Have an awesome day. Have an awesome Friday and weekend. And we wish you all the best in building effective boards.